Blood-curdling screams from Zoey Vance pierced the stillness of Paso Robles, California, as she ran through the dusty Main Street, her calico dress torn and mudded, her copper hair wild around her face. It was 1876, and the sleepy cattle town was unaccustomed to such commotion, especially from the respectable young schoolteacher who had arrived only 3 months prior. "Help! Please, someone help!" she cried, stumbling toward the marshal's office, her hands trembling as she pushed through the door. Marshal Caldwell looked up from his desk with irritation clear in his weathered face. At 52, he'd seen his fair share of hysterical women, and he wasn't in the mood for another. "Miss Vance," he said curtly, "I can hear you from clear across town. What in tarnation has gotten into you?" Zoey struggled to catch her breath, clutching the edge of his desk. "Marshal Caldwell, I've just come from the Wilkerson ranch. Mr. Wilkerson is dead, murdered, and the Callahan brothers have stolen his cattle. I saw them do it." The marshal's expression darkened as he leaned back in his chair. "That's a mighty serious accusation, Miss Vance. The Callahans are respected businessmen in these parts." "Businessmen," Zoey spat the word. "They're thieves and murderers." "I was riding back from the Hendersons' farm after delivering medicine to their sick child when I saw smoke coming from the Wilkerson place. When I arrived, I found Mr. Wilkerson." Her voice broke. "They shot him in the back, Marshal, and they were driving his cattle away." Marshal Caldwell stood, adjusting his gun belt. "And you expect me to believe that you, a city girl from Boston, can identify cattle rustlers at a distance? Did you see their faces clearly?" "Yes, it was them. I recognized their horses, their clothing. They even saw me. They shot at me as I fled." She thrust out her arm to show where a bullet had grazed her sleeve. The marshal examined the tear with skepticism. "Could have caught that on a branch running through the brush." "Why would I lie about this?" Zoey demanded. "Miss Vance, you've been in our town for all of 3 months. The Callahan family has been here for 20 years. They're the largest ranch owners in the county, benefactors to the town. What reason would they have to rustle Wilkerson's meager herd? Greed. Wilkerson's land borders their northern pasture. He refused to sell to them last month." The marshal sighed. "I'll ride out to check on Wilkerson, but I won't be making accusations against the Callahans without solid proof. Now go home and calm yourself. This isn't Boston. We handle things differently here." "But that'll be all, Miss Vance," he said firmly. Defeated, Zoey stepped back onto the boardwalk, the California sun beating down on her shoulders. She knew what she'd seen. Someone had to believe her. As she stood there, uncertain where to turn, a deep voice called from across the street. "Miss Vance, everything all right?" Yancy Xavier dismounted from his palomino, tying the horse to the hitching post outside the general store. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. At 28, he'd earned a reputation as one of the most skilled cowboys in the San Luis Obispo County, working as the foreman for the Circle P Ranch. "Mr. Xavier," Zoey acknowledged, wiping tears from her cheeks. "No, everything is not all right." Yancy crossed the street, removing his hat as he approached her. "What's happened? You're shaking like a leaf." The genuine concern in his eyes broke through her composure, and Zoey found herself recounting the entire terrible story once more. Unlike the marshal, Yancy listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "And the marshal won't believe you?" he asked when she'd finished. "He as much as called me a hysterical liar," she said bitterly. "He's riding out to check on Mr. Wilkerson, but he won't consider the Callahans as suspects." Yancy's jaw tightened. "That doesn't surprise me. The Callahans have half the county in their pocket, including Caldwell." He glanced down the street toward the saloon where the Callahan brothers, Victor and Thomas, often spent their afternoons. "Did they see you clearly?" I don't know. I didn't stay to find out." "Good." He placed his hat back on his head. "Stay at the boarding house today. Don't go anywhere alone." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have a look at Wilkerson's place myself. If what you say is true, and I believe it is, there'll be tracks, evidence." "You believe me?" The relief in her voice was palpable. "I've worked cattle my whole life, Miss Vance. I know the Callahans better than most, and I wouldn't put this past them. Besides," he added with the hint of a smile, "you don't strike me as the hysterical type." "I'm coming with you," she declared. "That wouldn't be wise. If the Callahans are behind this, they'll be watching for you. Mr. Wilkerson was my friend. I'm not going to cower in my room while his murderers go free." Yancy studied her for a long moment, admiration flickering in his eyes. "All right, but we'll need to be careful. Meet me behind the livery in half an hour. Bring a hat with a wide brim to hide your face." As Zoey hurried to the boarding house to change her torn dress, she felt a curious mix of grief, anger, and something else aflutter in her chest at the thought of Yancy Xavier believing her when no one else would. She'd noticed him around town since her arrival. It was hard not to notice a man like him, but they'd exchanged little more than pleasantries, until now. 30 minutes later, dressed in a simple blue riding dress and wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, Zoey slipped behind the livery stable where Yancy waited with 2 horses. "You ready for this?" he asked, helping her mount a gentle bay mare. "I have to see justice done," she replied, settling into the saddle. They rode out of town using the back trails, avoiding the main road where they might encounter the Marshal or, worse, the Callahans. The summer heat pressed down on them as they made their way through rolling golden hills dotted with oak trees. "How long have you been in Paso Robles?" Yancy asked as they rode. "Just over 3 months. The town needed a teacher and I needed a change from Boston." "That's quite a change." Zoey nodded. "My parents died last year, influenza. There was nothing keeping me there, and I'd always dreamed of seeing the West." "I'm sorry about your folks," Yancy said softly. "Is it everything you dreamed of out here?" "Some days," she admitted with a small smile. "Though I didn't anticipate witnessing a murder within my first season." They fell into a companionable silence as they approached Wilkerson's modest ranch. Smoke still rose from the smoldering ruins of the barn, and Zoey felt her throat tighten at the sight. "Stay behind me," Yancy instructed as they dismounted and tied their horses to a tree a safe distance away. The scene at the ranch was grim. Samuel Wilkerson's body lay face down near his corral, just as Zoey had described. The cattle were gone, and boot prints and hoof marks told the story of a hasty robbery. "You were right," Yancy said grimly, kneeling to examine the tracks. 4 men drove the cattle north initially, then circled back east. They're heading for the mountain pass, probably planning to sell them in Nevada." "How can you tell all that?" "Years of tracking cattle," he replied. "And these boot prints, see this star pattern? That's Thomas Callahan's custom boots. He had them made in San Francisco last year and won't stop bragging about them." Zoey felt sick looking at Wilkerson's body. "He was a kind man. He didn't deserve this." "Few do," Yancy said, standing. "We should check the house, see if there's anything else they took." The small ranch house had been ransacked, drawers emptied onto the floor, furniture overturned. "They were looking for something specific," Yancy noted, examining the mess. Zoey moved carefully through the front room. "Mr. Wilkerson mentioned he had proof the Callahans were moving boundary markers to claim portions of neighboring ranches. He was gathering evidence to present to the land office in Sacramento." "That would explain it," Yancy said. "If Wilkerson had documentation that could threaten their land claims, The Callahans would want it destroyed. A sound outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats approached several horses. "Quick," Yancy whispered, pulling Zoey toward the back door. It might be the Marshal, but it could also be the Callahans returning to clean up better. They slipped out the rear of the house just as riders entered the front yard. From their hiding place behind a woodpile, they could see Marshal Caldwell dismounting, accompanied by Victor Callahan himself. "See, Marshal. Just like I told you, some drifters must have done this. Probably the same bunch that hit the Johnson place last month," Victor was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Looks that way," Caldwell agreed, surveying the scene with far more interest than he'd shown Zoey's story. "Poor Wilkerson. Never did have much luck." "Those tracks head south," Victor said, pointing in the opposite direction from where the cattle had actually gone. "Probably heading for Mexico. You should gather a posse." "I'd like to believe this evidence is coincidence," Yancy whispered to Zoey, "but that's a deliberate misdirection. Victor knows exactly where those cattle went." "What do we do now?" Zoey asked. "We need to get back to town without them seeing us." "Then I'm going to have a talk with some people I trust. If the Marshal won't pursue the truth, others will." They waited until Caldwell and Callahan moved into the house before making their way back to their horses. Riding wide around the property, they took a longer route back to Paso Robles, arriving as dusk was settling over the town. "Come to my cabin for supper," Yancy said as they reached the livery. "It's not safe for you to be alone, and we need to make a plan." Zoey hesitated, aware of how it might look for an unmarried woman to visit a man's home alone. But the danger was real, and propriety seemed less important than survival. "All right," she agreed. "Let me get a few things from my room first." Yancy's cabin stood at the edge of town, a modest but well-maintained structure with a small corral and barn behind it. Inside was surprisingly comfortable, with handcrafted furniture and bookshelves filled with volumes that surprised Zoey. "You read Thoreau?" she asked, noticing a well-worn copy of Walden as Yancy lit the stove. He smiled, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She believed education was important even for a ranch hand." "She was right," Zoey said, running her finger along the spines of several classics. "Most people in Boston would be surprised to find a cowboy with such a library." "Most people have narrow ideas about cowboys," he replied, setting a pot of coffee to boil. "Just like they have narrow ideas about schoolteachers from Boston." Their eyes met, and Zoey felt that curious flutter again. There was something about Yancy Xavier that defied her expectations, something that made her feel both unsettled and secure at the same time. As they shared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and sourdough bread, Yancy outlined his plan. "I've known a few of the ranch hands who work for the Callahans. Not all of them are loyal, especially those who have seen the brothers' true nature. If we can get one of them to testify about what really happened today, it would carry more weight than your word alone." "But why would they risk crossing the Callahans? Money talks, and some men have a conscience that speaks louder than fear." Yancy hesitated. "There's something else you should know. This isn't the first time the Callahans have done something like this. 3 years ago, a rancher named McPherson accused them of similar tactics. He was found hanged from an oak tree a week later. They called it suicide. You don't believe it was?" Yancy's expression darkened. "McPherson was my friend. He wasn't the type to take his own life, especially not with a baby on the way." "I'm sorry," Zoey said softly. "Then you have personal reasons to want the Callahans brought to justice." "I do," he admitted. "But that doesn't change the facts of what happened today. You saw them murder Wilkerson and steal his cattle. That's not something I can ignore, regardless of my history with them. After supper, Yancy insisted Zoey take his bed while he slept on a bedroll by the fireplace. Exhausted from the day's events, she fell into a troubled sleep, haunted by images of Wilkerson's body and the sound of gunfire. She woke in the gray light before dawn to find Yancy already up, strapping on his gun belt. "I'm going to speak with Pete Guthrie," he explained. He worked for the Callahans until last month when he quit after an argument with Thomas. "If anyone will talk, it's him." "I'm coming with you," Zoey said, reaching for her boots. "Not this time. Pete's staying at a camp outside town with some other cowhands. It's no place for a lady, and your presence would only raise questions we don't need right now." Though frustrated, Zoey recognized the wisdom in his words. "What should I do? Stay here. Keep the door locked. There's a shotgun under the bed if you need it." After Yancy left, Zoey paced the small cabin, anxiety building with each passing hour. By mid-morning, unable to bear the confinement any longer, she decided to venture out to check on her students. School had been canceled the day before due to her absence, and she worried about the children. Dressing carefully and pinning her hair up under her hat, she slipped out of the cabin and made her way toward the schoolhouse. The town seemed unusually quiet for a weekday, with few people on the streets. As she passed the general store, she overheard fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "Found Xavier's cabin empty this morning when they went to arrest him. Schoolteacher probably fled with him. Callahan's offering $100 for information." Zoey ducked her head and hurried on, her mind racing. Why would they be looking to arrest Yancy? What had happened since he left that morning? The schoolhouse was locked, a notice on the door informing parents that classes were suspended until further notice by order of the town council. Zoey stared at it in disbelief. She needed to get back to the cabin before anyone recognized her. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Thomas Callahan himself. Well, he drawled, his thin lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Miss Vance." "Just the lady I've been looking for." Zoey stepped back, heart hammering. "Mr. Callahan, I was just checking on the schoolhouse." "I'm sure you were," he said, moving to block her path. "Interesting that you'd be concerned about school when you're wanted for questioning in Samuel Wilkerson's murder." "What?" Zoey gasped. "That's absurd. You killed him, I saw you." Thomas shook his head, feigning sadness. "Such a terrible accusation. Especially when we have a witness who saw you and that Cowboy Xavier at Wilkerson's place yesterday afternoon, going through his belongings. Quite suspicious, wouldn't you say?" Zoey's mind raced. They'd been seen, but the timeline was wrong. "That's not possible." "I found Mr. Wilkerson's body in the morning." "That's not what our witness says. And with your known friendship with Wilkerson and Xavier's grudge against my family, well," he shrugged, "Marshal Caldwell is very interested in speaking with you both." "This is ridiculous," Zoey said, trying to step around him. "Excuse me, Mr. Callahan." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "I don't think so, Miss Vance. The Marshal wants to see you and I aim to deliver you." "Let go of me," Zoey demanded, struggling against his grip. "Is there a problem here?" The new voice belonged to Mrs. Alina Whitman, the mayor's wife, who stood watching them with narrow-eyed suspicion. Thomas released Zoey immediately, his demeanor shifting to cordial respect. "No problem at all, Mrs. Whitman. Just having a conversation with our schoolteacher." "It didn't look like a friendly conversation to me," Alina said firmly. "Miss Vance, I was just heading to the dressmaker's. Would you care to accompany me?" Seizing the opportunity, Zoey moved quickly to Alina's side. "I would be delighted, Mrs. Whitman. Thank you." Thomas tipped his hat, his eyes hard despite his smile. "We'll continue our discussion later, Miss Vance. Good day, ladies." As they walked away, Alina kept a protective hand on Zoey's arm. "That man has always given me a chill. Are you all right, my dear?" "Yes, thank you," Zoey said, though her arm still ached where he had gripped it. "Mrs. Whitman, I need to tell you something important. It's about Mr. Wilkerson's death." Alina glanced around cautiously. "Not here. Come to my home. We can speak privately there." At the mayor's elegant house on the hill overlooking the town, Zoey told Alina everything from discovering Wilkerson's body to Yancy's investigation and the Callahan's apparent attempt to frame them. "This is very serious," Alina said when Zoey had finished. "My husband must hear this. The Callahans have influence, but Frederick still believes in justice." Mayor Whitman arrived home for lunch to find his wife and the schoolteacher waiting for him in his study. A tall, distinguished man with a reputation for fairness, he listened to Zoey's account with growing concern. "If what you say is true, Miss Vance, this is not merely murder and theft, but corruption extending to our own law enforcement," he said gravely. "Do you know where Mr. Xavier is now?" "He went to find a man named Pete Guthrie, a former Callahan employee who might testify against them." The mayor exchanged a look with his wife. "Pete Guthrie was found dead this morning outside of town, shot in the back." Zoey's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh no. Then Yancy is likely in great danger or already." He didn't finish the thought. "Miss Vance, I believe your story, but we need more than beliefs to confront the Callahans. They have money, influence, and apparently no qualms about eliminating obstacles." "What can we do?" Zoey asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "First, you'll stay here with us. It's safer than Xavier's cabin, which the Marshal has likely searched by now. Second, I'll send a telegram to the federal marshal in San Francisco. This situation requires outside intervention. And Yancy, we need to find him. I'll have my associates make discreet inquiries," the mayor promised. "If he's alive, we'll locate him." For 3 days, Zoey remained at the Whitmans' home, jumping at every sound, watching the road for any sign of Yancy. Word came that Marshal Caldwell had indeed searched Yancy's cabin and had posted wanted notices describing both Yancy and Zoey as persons of interest in Wilkerson's murder. On the morning of the 4th day, as Zoey sat by the window watching the sunrise, she noticed a figure moving through the garden below a man in a familiar hat. Heart racing, she rushed downstairs and out the back door to find Yancy crouched in the shadow of the garden wall, his face gaunt with exhaustion, a bandage visible beneath his torn shirt. "Yancy!" she cried, running to him. "Quiet," he warned, pulling her into the shadows with him. "I can't stay long. The Callahans have men watching the roads. We heard about Pete Guthrie. I thought you might be dead too." "Nearly was," he admitted. "They ambushed us on the trail. Pete took a bullet meant for me. I've been hiding in the hills trying to figure out our next move." "The mayor has sent for a federal marshal," Zoey told him, "but it could be days before he arrives." "We might not have days," Yancy said grimly. "The Callahans are planning to move Wilkerson's cattle across the state line tonight. Once they're gone, we lose our best evidence. What can we do?" "I need to get into town to the telegraph office. I have friends at the Circle P who will back us, but I need to get word to them. The Callahans will have men watching for you. I know. That's why I need your help." Within an hour, Zoey found herself walking openly down the main street of Paso Robles, heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. Beside her walked the mayor's young housekeeper, Martha, dressed in Zoey's clothes and with her face partially obscured by Zoey's distinctive bonnet. The diversion worked perfectly. 2 of the Callahan's men immediately began following Martha, leaving the real Zoey free to slip into the back of the telegraph office where Yancy waited, disguised in the clothes of the mayor's gardener. "It's done," the telegraph operator, a friend of Mayor Whitman's, confirmed after sending Yancy's message. "But you'd better clear out quick. Victor Callahan himself was in here not 20 minutes ago." They had just stepped into the alley behind the telegraph office when they heard shouting from the direction of the main street. "That's not Martha," a man's voice called. "It's a trick. Run," Yancy said, grabbing Zoey's hand. They fled through the back alleys of Paso Robles, ducking between buildings and dodging startled townspeople. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. "This way," Yancy directed, pulling her toward the livery stable. "I have horses waiting." But as they rounded the corner, they found their path blocked by Thomas Callahan and two of his men, guns drawn. "End of the line, Xavier," Thomas said, his voice coldly triumphant. "You and the schoolteacher are coming with us." Yancy pushed Zoey behind him, his hand moving to the gun concealed beneath his borrowed jacket. "Let her go, Callahan. Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel is with anyone who threatens my business," Thomas replied. "And she's seen too much. Now drop your weapon and come quietly, or this gets messy." For a terrible moment, Zoey thought Yancy might try to fight, a battle he couldn't possibly win against three armed men. But then his shoulders sagged and he slowly reached for his gun. "Wise choice," Thomas said. The sound of multiple horses approaching at speed made them all turn. Down the street came a group of riders, 6 men led by a tall figure Zoey didn't recognize. "That would be the cavalry," Yancy said, a smile breaking across his weary face. "What the hell?" Thomas growled, his gun still trained on them but his eyes on the approaching riders. "Evening, Thomas," called the leader as they drew closer. "Been a while." Thomas paled visibly. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" "Got a telegram saying my best ranch hand was in trouble," the man replied, dismounting smoothly. He was in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the confident bearing of a man used to authority. "Mr. Xavier works for me at the Circle P, and I take exception to anyone threatening my people." "This isn't your concern, Jackson," Thomas said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "When you murder a man and try to frame my foreman, it becomes my concern." Jackson turned to one of his men. "Fetch Marshal Caldwell. He needs to hear this." Within the hour, a remarkable scene unfolded in front of the marshal's office. Reuben Jackson, owner of the Circle P Ranch and one of the most respected cattlemen in California, stood before Marshal Caldwell and a growing crowd of townspeople, including Mayor Whitman. "I've here signed affidavits from 3 former employees of the Callahan Ranch," Jackson announced, holding up a sheaf of papers, "all testifying that they witnessed the Callahan brothers planning the murder of Samuel Wilkerson and the theft of his cattle. This is slander." Victor Callahan shouted from where he stood with his brother, both men now under the guard of Jackson's cowboys. "It's the truth," countered one of Jackson's men, stepping forward. "I worked your North Range for 2 years, Victor. I was there when you told Thomas to handle Wilkerson permanently. I quit that same day, but I heard about the plans to rustle his herd after." Marshal Caldwell looked increasingly uncomfortable. "These are serious accusations against prominent citizens. We need more than just words. How about physical evidence?" Yancy spoke up. "The cattle stolen from Wilkerson's ranch are currently being held in the Box Canyon on the northeast corner of Callahan land. They still bear Wilkerson's brand, which would be illegal to alter. And Thomas Callahan is wearing custom boots with a star pattern on the sole boots that will match the prints found at the murder scene." "And what about the witness who places you and Miss Vance at Wilkerson's ranch yesterday afternoon?" Caldwell challenged. "A fabrication," Mayor Whitman interjected. "Miss Vance was with my wife at that time taking tea. I have multiple witnesses who can confirm this." The crowd murmured, sentiment clearly shifting against the Callahans and, by extension, Marshal Caldwell. "I demand these men be arrested," Jackson said firmly, "for murder, cattle rustling, and obstruction of justice." Caldwell hesitated, looking from Jackson to the Callahans and back again. It was clear that he was calculating his options, weighing his long-standing alliance with the Callahans against the overwhelming evidence and public opinion. "Marshal," Zoey said, stepping forward, "I know you didn't believe me when I came to you. I was a stranger in town, and the Callahans were your friends. But now you have testimony from respected ranchers, physical evidence, and the eyes of this entire town upon you. What will you do?" A tense silence fell over the crowd as they waited for Caldwell's decision. Finally, with visible reluctance, he nodded. "Victor and Thomas Callahan, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Wilkerson and the theft of his property," he announced. "Johnson, Pearson, take them into custody." A cheer went up from the gathered townspeople as the Callahan brothers were led away, their protests falling on deaf ears. In that moment, the balance of power in Paso Robles shifted palpably. As the crowd began to disperse, Reuben Jackson approached Yancy and Zoey. "You two have shown remarkable courage," he said. "Miss Vance, I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "Reuben Jackson, at your service." "Zoey Vance," she replied, taking his offered hand. "I can't thank you enough for arriving when you did." "Thank your cowboy here," Jackson said with a nod toward Yancy. "He's the finest foreman I've ever employed, and his telegraph convinced me to ride through the night with my men." "He's not my cowboy," Zoey said quickly, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. Jackson smiled knowingly. "My mistake." "In any case, Yancy, when you're ready to return to work, your position is waiting, though I suspect you might have other priorities at the moment." He glanced meaningfully between them before tipping his hat and moving away to speak with the mayor. Left alone, Zoey turned to Yancy, suddenly shy despite everything they'd been through together. "You saved my life. We saved each other," he corrected gently, "and exposed murderers in the process. Not bad for a schoolteacher and a cowboy. What happens now?" she asked, aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth in his storm-gray eyes. "Now," Yancy said, taking her hand carefully in his, "I'd like to call on you properly, Miss Vance, without murderers chasing us if possible." Zoey felt that flutter again, stronger this time. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Xavier." In the days that followed, justice moved swiftly through Paso Robles. A federal marshal arrived to oversee the case against the Callahans, bringing with him evidence of their involvement in similar crimes across the county. Marshal Caldwell, implicated in covering up previous incidents, was removed from his position and replaced temporarily by a deputy from San Francisco. Wilkerson's cattle were recovered, and with no family to claim them, were purchased by Reuben Jackson, who set aside the profits in a fund for the town school, a gesture that earned him the gratitude of Paso Robles' new schoolteacher. True to his word, Yancy began calling on Zoey properly. Their courtship became the talk of the town. The dramatic circumstances of their meeting transformed into a romantic tale that grew more elaborate with each telling. For Zoey, who had come west seeking a new beginning, life in Paso Robles took on an unexpected sweetness. Her students returned to school, their numbers growing as families from outlying ranches, no longer intimidated by the Callahans, moved closer to town. In the evenings, she often sat on the porch of her small rented cottage grading papers while Yancy read aloud from one of his books. "Do you miss Boston?" he asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson. Zoey considered the question, thinking of the life she'd left behind, the rigid society, the painful memories after her parents' deaths, the sense of suffocation she'd felt. "No," she said honestly. "Boston was my past. This is my future." "And what do you see in that future?" Yancy asked, his voice carrying a hint of vulnerability she'd rarely heard from him. Zoey turned to face him, taking in the strong lines of his face, the gentle intelligence in his eyes, the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "I see possibility," she said softly. "I see a life that I choose, not one chosen for me." Yancy nodded, understanding in his expression. "When I first came west, that's what I was looking for too, the freedom to define myself, to build something of my own." "Have you found it?" "I thought I had," he said, his gaze intensifying. "But now I realize I was still missing something important." "And what's that?" "Someone to share it with." The air between them seemed to still, the moments suspended in the golden light of the fading day. "Zoey," Yancy said, taking her hands in his, "I know it's only been a few months since we met and under the strangest circumstances imaginable. But in that time, I've come to know you, your courage, your intelligence, your heart. And I find myself thinking about a future that includes you in every part of it." Zoey's breath caught as he released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, producing a small ring with a modest diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. "This was my mother's," he explained. "She told me to give it to a woman as strong and true as she was. I can't think of anyone who fits that description better than you." "Yancy," Zoey whispered, her heart racing. "Zoey Vance, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of building that future together, whatever it might hold?" Without hesitation, Zoey nodded, tears of joy springing to her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." As Yancy slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into a tender kiss, Zoey thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment, from the refined drawing rooms of Boston to a dusty California town, from the terror of witnessing a murder to the joy of finding a partner who valued her courage and believed in her truth. They were married in October, when the summer heat had given way to the gentler warmth of autumn. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the schoolhouse where Zoey taught. Reuben Jackson stood as Yancy's best man, while Alina Whitman attended Zoey. "Never seen a couple more suited to each other," Jackson remarked during the celebration afterward. "Both of you too stubborn to back down when it matters." Alina agreed, adding with a smile, "It's not every couple who can say they brought down criminals together before they even shared their first dance." As a wedding gift, Jackson offered Yancy a partnership in a new venture, a smaller ranch bordering the Circle P, where Yancy could build a home and raise his own stock while continuing to work as Jackson's foreman. "It's good land," Jackson told them. "Not too far from town for the schoolteacher to make her daily rounds, but enough space for a man to breathe and grow something worthwhile." It was more than they could have hoped for a place of their own, work they both loved, and the support of a community that had come to respect and care for them. Their first home on the new ranch was modest, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, built with the help of friends from town and cowhands from the Circle P. But to Zoey, it was a palace compared to her cramped quarters at the boarding house. "It's not what you were used to in Boston," Yancy said as they stood together in their new home the day after moving in. "It's better," Zoey assured him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "It's ours." Life settled into a rhythm, Zoey riding to town each weekday to teach, Yancy dividing his time between the Circle P and their own growing operation. In the evenings, they would share the day's events over supper, then sit together by the fire, reading or simply talking about their dreams for the future. Sometimes, Zoey would think about that terrible day when she had discovered Wilkerson's body, when she had run through town screaming for help only to be dismissed and disbelieved. How different her life might have been if Yancy hadn't been there, if he hadn't listened when no one else would. "What are you thinking about?" Yancy asked one night, finding her staring pensively into the fire. "About how easily things could have gone another way," she admitted. "If you hadn't believed me about the Callahans, if you hadn't helped me stand up to them." Yancy took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band that now accompanied her engagement ring. "I like to think we would have found each other anyway," he said. "Some things are just meant to be. The schoolteacher and the cowboy," Zoey smiled. "I'm not sure everyone would have seen that coming." "Their loss," Yancy replied, drawing her close. "I knew you were special from the moment I saw you standing on that boardwalk, refusing to be silenced even when no one would listen." As winter settled over Paso Robles, bringing cool rains that turned the hills a vibrant green, Zoey discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled their small home with even greater joy and anticipation. "You think it's a boy or a girl?" Yancy asked one evening as they lay in bed, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I don't know," Zoey replied. "Does it matter to you?" "Not in the slightest," he assured her. "Boy or girl, this child will know how to read and ride, how to stand up for the truth and help those who need it just like both parents." Zoey smiled in the darkness, thinking of the family they were creating, a blend of their different backgrounds and shared values. "I love you, Yancy Xavier," she whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Zoey Xavier," he replied, the name still new enough to bring a smile to both their faces. "More every day." Spring arrived, bringing with it new calves on their small ranch and the visible evidence of Zoey's pregnancy. Though she continued teaching, the town council had already begun searching for a temporary replacement to take over her duties when the baby arrived in late summer. "You're certain you want to return to teaching afterward?" Alina Whitman asked during one of her regular visits to the ranch. "Many women find motherhood quite consuming." "I'm certain," Zoey replied, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Teaching is part of who I am, just as ranching is part of who Yancy is. Our child will benefit from seeing parents who pursue their passions." Alina smiled approvingly. "You two continue to defy conventions. It's quite refreshing." In May, news reached them that the Callahan brothers had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. The execution was carried out in San Francisco, away from the town they had terrorized for so long. "Does it give you peace?" Zoey asked Yancy when he returned from receiving the telegram. "Not peace exactly," he said thoughtfully, "but closure. For Wilkerson, for McPherson, for all the others they hurt over the years, justice may be slow, but it does come eventually." As Zoey's due date approached, Yancy became increasingly attentive, often arranging for one of the ranch hands to cover his duties so he could remain close to home. He expanded their house, adding a proper bedroom for the baby and a larger kitchen where Zoey could work more comfortably. On a sweltering August day, after nearly 20 hours of labor attended by the town's midwife and Alina Whitman, Zoey gave birth to a healthy son with a shock of dark hair and eyes that hinted they might one day match his father's storm-gray shade. "Samuel," Yancy suggested as he held his son for the first time, tears glistening in his eyes. "After Wilkerson. If it hadn't been for him, for what happened that day, we might never have found each other." "Samuel Reuben Xavier," Zoey agreed, tired but radiant. "For the two men who helped bring us together." Word of the birth spread quickly through Paso Robles, and visitors soon arrived bearing gifts and well wishes. Jackson was among the first, bringing a hand-carved cradle and the news that he had set aside a portion of his best grazing land as a graduation gift for young Samuel when he came of age. Every boy should have something to build on, he explained with a wink to the proud parents. As autumn returned to Paso Robles, painting the landscape in golden hues once more, Zoey sat on the porch of their expanded home, nursing Samuel while Yancy worked in the corral, breaking a spirited colt. The scene was so perfect, so far from the life she had imagined for herself when she first journeyed west, that she sometimes had to remind herself it was real. "What are you smiling about?" Yancy asked, coming to join her when his work was done. "Everything," Zoey replied simply. "This life we've built. The fact that I almost turned around and went back to Boston after my first week here." "You never told me that," Yancy said, surprised. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Everything was so different, so wild compared to what I knew. But something made me stay, some sense that there was more waiting for me here if I just had the courage to find it." Yancy sat beside her, gently touching their sleeping son's cheek. "I'm grateful every day that you stayed," he said. "That you had the courage not just to remain in Paso Robles, but to stand up for the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent." "As am I," Zoey said, leaning against his shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations." As the sun set over their ranch, casting long shadows across the land that was now undeniably theirs, Yancy and Zoey Xavier shared a moment of perfect contentment, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had faced danger and doubt together, and who had emerged stronger for it. In the years that followed, their family grew. A daughter, Elena, joined them 2 years after Samuel, followed by twins, Jackson and Josephine, 3 years later. Their ranch prospered, eventually expanding to become one of the most successful in the county. Zoey continued teaching until she was appointed superintendent of schools for the entire district, a position that allowed her to implement progressive educational ideas throughout the region. Paso Robles grew as well, transforming from a dusty cattle town to a thriving community known for its mineral springs and vineyards. The story of how a Boston schoolteacher and a bookish cowboy had brought down the notorious Callahan brothers became local legend, embellished with each telling until it achieved almost mythical status. But for Yancy and Zoey, the true miracle was found in the quiet moments in family suppers around their large oak table, in teaching their children to ride and read with equal enthusiasm, in the partnership they had forged that honored both their differences and their shared values. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they stood together on the porch of the grand home that had replaced their modest first dwelling, Yancy took Zoey's hand just as he had done that day outside the Marshal's office. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen the Callahans that day?" he asked. "If you'd taken a different route back to town?" Zoey considered the question, looking out over the land they had nurtured together, at the children now almost grown who bore the best of both their characters. "I think we would have found each other eventually," she said, echoing his words from long ago. "Some things are just meant to be." And as the setting sun gilded the landscape in the same golden light that had illuminated their first kiss, Yancy and Zoey sealed their enduring love with another, just as tender and true as it had been on that fateful day when a brave schoolteacher and the cowboy who believed her changed the course of their lives forever.